Welcome to Babel, Translating the Middle East, a podcast from the Middle East program at CSIS. Here on Babel, we take you beyond the headlines to take a closer look at what's happening in the Middle East and why it matters. This week on Babel, I speak with Karim Elgendy, who's an expert on climate and energy policy in the Middle East and North Africa. He's also an associate director at Buro Happold, an associate fellow at Chatham House, and a senior non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute. Together, we talk about the geopolitics of climate change, the challenges hindering climate diplomacy, and some Arab governments' efforts to produce more oil now to prepare for a world that consumes less oil. Then I continue the conversation with Todman and Leah Hickert to discuss climate's role in regional diplomacy and the public discourse around climate in the Middle East. To translate some of what's happening in the Middle East, this is Babel. Karim, welcome to Babel.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having me.
What role do you see climate playing in regional conflict? Peter Schwartzstein, the journalist, has a book coming out in the fall with a subtitle On the Front Lines of Climate Violence. Do we have to think about climate in terms of contributing to instability in the Middle East?
So climate has been considered within academic and policy circles as a threat multiplier. However, this conversation has reached no conclusive evidence that climate is intrinsically a cause of conflict. In other words, there's no causality between climate change on the one hand and violent conflict on the other. The example that is often cited is the conflict in Syria. And there's certainly no doubt that an increase in temperature and a drought in northeast Syria has led to the migration of subsistence farmers away from areas like Hasaka and Raqqa towards the main urban areas further to the west in Homs and Halab and also Daraa. This forced rural to urban migration as a result of the drought, which anecdotally was the worst drought Syria had experienced in the last 800 years, according to some estimates by NASA. This has done two things. One, it has obviously relocated 800,000 people into new areas where they have no jobs, they have no skills, there's no services for them, but they also lost all their wealth because 85% of all privately owned cattle have reportedly died. Now, does that lead to conflict? Does that create enough instability? Does it create enough social discontent within those cities and that they have moved to the outskirts of? That's still subject to debate. I would say there is some correlation between the occurrence of climate change impacts and specifically for the most vulnerable amongst us, but there is no causality.
How should we think about climate as an international threat to stability? Certainly, there's been increasing criticism of Turkey building dams and causing some of the drought in downstream areas, including Iraq. Is climate creating a Middle East that is more likely to have international conflict?
If one looks at the literature in the last few decades, in terms of the historical record of cases of collaboration between nation states within the MENA region and cases of conflict between them over those resources, one finds more cases for collaboration than cases for conflict. And that suggests that there might be hope that nations of the region will come together and perhaps collectively overcome this particular challenge. The climate change impacts will admittedly get worse, and this ability to collaborate in the face of such challenge will be something that we will have to wait and see. The other issue is that conflicts between nations is slightly different than conflicts within certain nations, the conflicts that can sometimes overlay with certain schisms between sectarian parts of a country, say, for example, Iraq or Lebanon, where those sectarian fault lines do exist. Any overlaying of climate impact differentiation across those dividing lines could result in worsening sectarian relationships within those countries.
Do the different aspects of climate change affect things in similar ways? That is, water shortages, rising temperatures, increasingly strong storms, including dust storms. Do they work the same way and provide the same accelerants to alienation as well as possibility for international coordination, or are they different?
Well, it really all depends on how they affect specific economic sectors. So the main challenges from climate change aren't always the primary impacts of climate change. So sometimes the secondary and even the tertiary impacts of climate change. If you look across the MENA region, the main impacts of climate change are an increase in the maximum temperature in the summer, an increase in variability of rainfall. In other words, you get longer droughts, but also when it does rain, it will rain more intensely and lead to flooding. And a reduction in overall precipitation where it does rain, so in the Levant and in parts of North Africa on the Atlas Mountains, while in the Gulf you get slightly more precipitation from obviously a very low base. That means certain impacts on certain economic sector. Tourism, for example, will be hit pretty badly because less water for tourist activities, worse environmental conditions in terms of increased temperature will not draw as many tourists. But the sector that will get affected most in terms of productivity is agriculture. And agricultural productivity dropping will be a real issue, not just in terms of food security, but a lot of countries depend on cash crops. They export high-value produce to other countries and then import main staples in order to feed their own populations. Those sectors being affected will lead to two things. Will lead to obviously loss of jobs, but also a reduction in GDP. And this is where it gets really interesting in terms of how do these socioeconomic impacts then translate into political impacts within the same nation. I wouldn't look at them as one primary impact and how it can lead to conflict directly, but I would look at this cascading of impacts altogether. However, having said that, there is one climate change impact, albeit very long term, that could independently disrupt a few things. The rise of sea level globally could potentially create some disruptions in terms of the coastlines, in terms of island disappearance, and it could force certain countries to redefine exclusive economic zones. So that could lead to potential disputes over fishing, over mineral resource extraction, etc. The one example I would give here is from the Gulf. There's hundreds of small islands, and if those do disappear, then a redelineation between the countries might be in order.
On the global side, you've written recently about the role that great powers are playing dealing with climate issues in the Middle East. How are they engaging in climate issues?
So great power competition is certainly rising. And in the Middle East specifically, there's this perceived, quote-unquote, withdrawal of the United States. And that has led to a number of players seeking more influence within that region. Whether that withdrawal is true or not, at least there's that perception. Those great powers, specifically China and its Belt and Road Initiative, are trying to make forays. They're trying to have more influence within the region and in other regions around the world. And they do this by investing, providing technical support, providing financial support for projects. And as the project flows, as the finance flows, have shifted towards less development aid and more climate aid or climate support, we're finding that climate has become one of those pawns and those infrastructure investment tools. That is becoming more obvious in the case of the Global Gateway, which is this new infrastructure investment initiative by the European Union, but also by the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, which is a US-led G7 initiative. And they both have climate at the core of what they want to do. They have them as one of their guiding lights, if you like. However, after 10 years of operation of the Belt and Road Initiative, last year there was a rethink, and one of the current guiding principles of this new vision for the Belt and Road Initiative was to have a greener Belt and Road Initiative, which means more renewable energy projects, more investment into greener infrastructure. And I think what that does is creates competition between those major players in areas that are currently devoid of any collective action, any partnership, any shared vision over what climate action looks like, and could result in more fragmentation because it leads to more fragmented action rather than collective action. If China comes in with its own tech, its own standards, its own workers, it will produce something in one country that is significantly different and certainly not coordinated in any way from a similar project that is done in a country next door that is funded by the PGII or by the Global Gateway.
And certainly you could have some countries building gas power plants, which are better than coal, but not have a much higher carbon impact than solar or wind or something else.
Absolutely. And we had seen that initially, before China did that revision, in that certain countries were inclined to follow where the money was. And if China was providing a vision with no strings attached, with minimal climate action, there was the countries being forced to make that choice. And if there's finance available from the BRI and the terms were agreeable, so why do we bother with all these issues in terms of emissions associated with those projects and commitments by the EU or the United States-led PGII? But now I think all those infrastructure investment initiatives are basically moving in the same direction. They all see that the finance flows are going in that way, and many of the development projects now have a green color of some sort.
So you've been around all these climate conferences and you've seen climate diplomacy. Is climate statecraft different from regular diplomacy in your mind?
Yes. So in climate negotiations, statecraft is very present. Countries are there to protect their own interests in this new world, this new economy being forged as we speak. But at the same time, this is a collective challenge. So there is a constant reminder for all of us that we're doing this for future generations. I don't think any of those who are in the negotiation rooms will live to see the impacts themselves. But there's this higher responsibility that some of those countries and some of those negotiators do have towards the future generations. And we've seen that when John Kerry, during signing the Paris Agreement, brought his granddaughter who sat on his lap as he was signing that. And I think that was a gesture for all of us that this is for them. Having said that, the diplomacy and the use of climate to advance national interests is also always there. There's countries use the goodwill that climate does provide to win friends. And you see that sometimes in certain investment, even by medium powers trying to invest into perhaps more developing economies in order to advance their own interests, but also increase their influence.
But it also feels to me like in climate diplomacy, the blocks are very different. There's a near-term cost and a long-term benefit. It feels to me like it requires a very certain kind of diplomat who won't be able to harvest the fruits of his or her efforts.
So the blocks are largely along the lines of developing versus developed. And the developed economies have always argued that they recognize that they have a bigger responsibility for historical emissions, but at the same time, they argue that if we don't work together, there's no way that just by climate action by Europe, North America, and others, could we reverse this increase in carbon emissions in the atmosphere. The emissions from China, for example, are too high for West-led action to be sufficient. However, on the other hand, the developing economies are arguing, well, we haven't created this mess and it shouldn't be upon us to bear the load when in fact we're trying to get to basic economic development that the West had enjoyed for decades, centuries.
And to the contrary, in many cases, they're arguing for loss and damage, that they be compensated both for the consequences of climate change in their own countries and that their transition to more environmentally sensitive technologies be subsidized by other countries.
This whole argument over that delineation between developing and developed has been largely put to rest when this principle called the Common but Differentiated Responsibilities was agreed within the United Nations framework for climate change. And what has been agreed is that we will all work together, but we'll work together in a voluntary way, as you could see in the Paris Agreement, where we collectively will make sure that the temperature doesn't exceed 2 degrees, ideally not 1.5, a goal which there's no chance we will meet at this point. But at the same time, each and every one of us, countries that are parties to the agreement, will do what we can. So you add it all up and it doesn't add up right. It comes to 3 degrees, you add it all up and it comes to 2.7, and it has never bridged that gap between the collective action and the individual country action. And this is a conundrum at the heart of climate governance today, that we couldn't force any nation to do anything. We failed miserably at doing so in Copenhagen a few years ago. And the Paris Agreement has got this fault at the heart of it. And it relies on shaming countries and on lobbying. And one more point I wanted to mention, in addition to these two main groups, the developed economies and the developing economies, is that there are the low-lying islands. And those are often a collective of countries that are deemed most at risk, that are lobbying for the highest level of ambition. They in a way represent our conscience because they argue, for example, for the 1.5 limit rather than 2-degree limit because they are the ones who will see that impact most and will suffer from the consequences most. As a matter of fact, many of them will have to move. Kiribati recently bought land in Fiji for that reason.
But the third group of countries are energy producers, many of which are not in the Western developed economy camp. Countries like the UAE, Saudi Arabia, they're Middle Eastern countries that arguably have a greater interest in stability in the region, but have their own view about how long the world should be using carbon fuels. How do they see climate diplomacy? How do they see regional diplomacy as it connects to climate diplomacy?
So on the Gulf producers' position, there is a recognition that the world has decided it will move away from fossil fuels. Now, what does that transition look like? What does the curve look like in terms of demand and reduction of demand past 2030s and beyond? That's subject to debate between the IEA and the OPEC, etc. But certainly the producers want to ensure that there is a market for fossil fuels for as long as possible. And they do make a strong economic and moral case for that. They argue that their oil and gas is the cheapest per barrel for extraction, but they also argue that its own extraction has the lowest carbon footprint compared to any other extraction, which is about a seventh of the total emissions of any given barrel. So in a way, they would argue that they should be the last producer standing. But from the diplomatic position, those countries place themselves within the context of the Paris Agreement, that they're going to do their part. They will have net zero carbon goals by 2060 and 2050 in some cases. But at the same time, they want to make sure that they will continue producing. So in a coincidence that can only happen in the Gulf, we have internal decarbonization, which releases more oil and gas that would have otherwise been consumed internally, being available for export to the global market. And it's being available and pushed out essentially as fast as possible. And the other twist to this is that the money that is generated, this extra cash that is generated by releasing a few million extra barrels of oil from the Gulf into the global market, is that money is then pumped back into the economy to fund a move away from fossil fuels. So in other words, diversification and decarbonization. So we have this race against time where countries of the region are trying to decarbonize, diversify, by pumping every drop of oil in order to fund that. In other words, oil has become a necessity and an urgent one in order to facilitate the existence of this region in a world where no oil is required.
The head of Aramco said last month that in 2050, he expected that 80% of Saudi Arabia's markets will be in the global south. Does that sound right to you, that the Western world is likely to decarbonize, but for most people in the world, they'll still have very carbon-intensive lives?
There's that too, of course. So on the one hand, the demand from the global north will come down, either because there is a need for higher energy independence, as you see, for example, in the EU, which has reduced its use of gas significantly, 20% in 1 year. But there's also an increase in population, urbanization, and standard of living expected in Africa and in Asia. That might also contribute to this increasing demand for fossil fuels. And what really those regions should do is leapfrog this entire process and achieve energy security, achieve greener growth by skipping over that fossil fuel stage and moving directly into development that is built around renewable energy and built around energy efficiency.
Are Middle Eastern countries uniquely willing to sacrifice for climate goals because the region is more susceptible to climate change? Or is the Middle East typical in that no government is really, at this point, willing to make big sacrifices for climate goals?
I would argue that there's no government in the world that is willing to make significant sacrifices for climate goals. The way climate governance works is every nation for itself. And only when countries realized that it's in their interest to join that bandwagon and to shape new rules for the global economy rather than become a rule taker a few years down the line, this is when they actually take real action. And it's not as sacrifices, it's actually for their own political, geopolitical, and economic gain. with a minor exception of some Scandinavian countries, some European countries that consider their historic responsibility to be an additional driver for climate action and for fighting climate change. No nation actually does that. And despite the dire future that faces the Middle East and North Africa, the region has so many challenges to prevent it from actually sacrificing anything at this point. It hardly can make ends meet, let alone sacrifice current standards of living for future standard of living. There are too many fires in the region for it to think in that mindset.
Do you think there's an incident that could provide an inflection point for the region, or is that just unlikely?
The more we see extreme weather events and the more it hurts, the more this could lead to inflection points. So, for example, the economic calculation for investing in stormwater management in some Gulf cities has been entirely revisited when an actual flood did happen, an urban flooding did happen, and it led to significant economic losses. So this is when you start thinking about it. Perhaps we should consider climate more seriously because it's actually in our economic interest.
Karim Elgendy, thanks very much for joining us on Babel.
Thank you.
Over the years, what role have you seen climate play in regional diplomacy?
A number of regional states have tried to make climate their own. We had both Egypt and the United Arab Emirates hosting the climate conferences. But it also seems to me that for all of the regional engagement on climate, there's a little bit of a disconnect. These are states that are really affected by climate. There are states that have opportunities to do things with climate, partly because there's so much sunlight in the Middle East. But I think Middle Eastern states, among many, are still trying to wrap their heads around what climate diplomacy looks like, how to deal with opportunities, how to get other countries to make commitments. It feels to me like they are engaging in climate diplomacy, but maybe not as effectively as the stakes are going to require them to engage in climate diplomacy, because climate is really going to rock the Middle East as much as any region in the world, and probably more than most.
I agree. And the danger as those effects really take shape and become apparent is that some of the states could take a really securitized view of this. And that securitized approach could then deter some of the collaboration which is actually necessary to effectively tackle them. So there are some issues now which I think are gaining a lot more attention. Dust and sandstorms are certainly one of them. And we've seen several initiatives to bring together regional actors to come up with a collaborative approach to them. Iran hosted a conference last summer under the auspices of the UN. Saudi Arabia has just hosted a set of conferences as well. And part of the danger with this is that dust and sandstorms are really difficult to tackle. The solutions are about changing how land is used and coming up with different kinds of vegetation which is appropriate for the areas. These are all really long-term solutions which are going to take a long time to become apparent. And if these states don't see the benefits of the collaboration, then I think they might start to take their own approach. A lot of these states want to be seen as leaders on climate as well. Certainly Egypt and the UAE hosting the COP conferences, but also Saudi Arabia. It has this Middle East Green Initiative, which, looks quite flashy. It's not entirely clear what it actually involves yet. And I think we might see more competition for regional leadership on climate than collaboration, at least in the years ahead.
And competition can be constructive and can be helpful as countries try to really excel. And competition can undermine cooperation. And again, I think the jury is still out on how this balance falls. But what's clear to a growing number of government leaders is this is an issue which is going to rise in importance and test their governance abilities, and is going to, in the long run, be profoundly consequential. And that means building up now what is going to have to be an even greater ability as this problem grows worse, either in terms of heat and humidity, in terms of rainwater, in terms of drought. These are going to be the things that will have a profound impact on the region in the second half of the 21st century.
So governments are paying more attention to these climate issues, but what is the public discourse around climate really like in the region? How often do you hear about it? What are people saying about it?
It's the most obvious times when it grabs national attention or regional attention is when there are these big climate disasters. So the floods in Libya are a clear example of that. The flooding that we just saw in Dubai and in Oman as well, I think also really captured a lot of public attention. But then it depends who you're referring to when you talk about people in the region. There are a class of really committed activists who speak about climate in ways that are very similar to how a lot of people in the US speak about it. They talk about greenhouse gas emissions, rising sea levels, things like that, mitigation, adaptation. And then I think there are a lot of other people who do talk about the effects of climate crises, climate change, but probably like Karim was saying, it comes out in a sort of secondary or tertiary way. I talked to some people in Tunisia about this, and they were saying you can't talk about CO2 emissions and connect with poor people in Tunisia. But if you talk about unemployment, and if you talk about the rising cost of living, whether that's as it relates to food costs or things like that, factors which affect daily lives in a very acute way and which are exacerbated by climate, then it connects. But I think for a lot of these people, talking about climate directly still feels like a sort of luxury as they have more pressing concerns.
And I think that's almost universal because, for example, multi-billion-dollar cost to Hurricane Sandy in New York. I don't hear anybody talking about Hurricane Sandy in New York, including in New York. And here was a place that was really profoundly affected. There's a way in which I think the world needs to wrap its head around how to treat climate as an urgent issue where actions have impacts. There are still a number of people in the United States who say climate's just a money pit and a scam. I think there are a lot of people in the Middle East who say it's God's will and there's nothing we can do about it. And getting to a constructive place where people say, no, this is a necessary investment. It has to be X% of our national budget. We have to do this for adaptation. We have to do this for mitigation. It feels to me like no country is really where it needs to be. And Middle Eastern countries are much further than they need to be, partly because a number of them have very high emissions to start with, and partly because the impacts of climate are going to be so much sharper for them than for countries in much of the rest of the world.
Karim said that climate is now part of most infrastructure investment initiatives in the region. How much of that do you think is greenwashing, and how much of it seems genuine?
So I've heard a huge shift in the prioritization of the environment as it relates to international engagement in the region, not just in infrastructure, but across a whole host of different interventions. So humanitarian organizations now are encouraged to think in terms of the environmental impact in a way that is much starker than ever before. Some of that I think is good. Sometimes, though, the effect means with so many people rushing to focus on environmental issues and climate issues that really don't have the necessary background and expertise, you end up with some really silly initiatives that are totally unimpactful and are certainly greenwashing. On a recent trip when I was talking about job creation, and I asked some of the people I was interviewing, what do green jobs mean? And someone said to me, oh, we have a recycling waste paper basket. So I think that counts as a green job, right? If we work in that office. And he was joking, but he was also saying there aren't clear definitions of this. And so even though donors or international actors might have some stipulations that there be a climate and environmental piece to a program, doesn't mean that's real at all.
That being said, there are billions and billions of dollars going into the Middle East now. I think some of that is going toward environmental initiatives. Some of it's going toward hydrogen, which Middle Eastern states see as a real potential revenue generator. I think a lot of the issues of what's going to be economical in 10 or 20 years are still a little bit over the horizon. It's hard to tell. But it does feel to me like you are starting to see real dollars and reals and dirhams and other things going into investments that are predicated on the energy transition, that are predicated on the necessity to change the way things operate. It's one thing to make policy proclamations, and we've seen a fair bit of that. But it does feel to me like we're reaching a point where there really are billions of dollars, partly from the region and partly from outside the region, going into some of these projects. And with billions of dollars comes change. How much of the necessity that will fill, I don't know. Whether it will be enough to insulate the Middle East from the worst effects of climate change, I don't know. But it does feel to me like there's a reality to this because of the investment that will make it a real factor in the region going forward.
Great. Thank you for joining me, Jon and Will.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leah. Thanks for listening to Babel. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can find more analysis on this topic linked in the show notes on the CSIS website, and you can find us on Twitter at CSIS Mideast.